Former New York Governor Andrew Cuomo's attorney is asking the Albany sheriff to save records after Cuomo was charged with forcible touching last week. The New York Times reports the criminal complaint came after 2 months of investigation into flight records, cell phone data, and hundreds of pages of testimony and documents. The former governor says the charge was politically motivated and based on flimsy evidence. Cuomo resigned from office in August after a state attorney general report that found he sexually harassed 11 women. When he resigned, he said, quote, "In my mind, I never crossed the line with anyone, but I didn't realize the extent to which the line has been redrawn." For more, let's bring in Alyssa Katz. Alyssa is the deputy editor with The City. Alyssa, welcome. Good to have you back on the program. So how is the former governor's defense team hoping that the preservation of these records can help them?
Well, I mean, the defense team has said from the beginning that they have major questions about the recollections and timing of the events as documented in this report commissioned by State Attorney Letitia James, and specifically that the accuser, who we now know is Brittany Cuomos, a former assistant to the governor. She alleged that the governor had put her hand under her blouse and above her bra on her breast inside the governor's mansion, and didn't recall the timing of that incident or the alleged incident, but they had placed it roughly in mid to late November of last year. And then what you saw in this criminal complaint that was released is that the date now under scrutiny and really in connection with these charges is December 7th. So they've from the beginning suggested that there are a lot of questions about this account and this testimony about when she would have been alone, if at all, with the governor in the mansion. And so they're trying to, I think, find as many holes as possible that they can potentially poke in the prosecution's case.
All right. Well, New York Attorney General Letitia James, you mentioned her office released that scathing report on Cuomo. She announced a run for governor a short time after. Talk to us, Alyssa, about the relationship between the offices of Attorney General and governor in the state of New York.
So, one interesting piece of history here is, that Andrew Cuomo himself had served as Attorney General in New York, and in fact had investigated the governor at the time. And so I think that it is, historically, there has been both a tension between those two offices, and that there is a duty of the Attorney General to investigate wrongdoing in government. That's part of their job. At the same time, that same Attorney General, it's also part of their job to represent the governor and the state of New York in criminal proceedings. And so this can lead to a lot of tensions in different directions. I mean, of course, the situation with Letitia James as the current Attorney General has reached a whole other level because, she, first of all, initially did this investigation or commissioned this group of attorneys to lead the investigation into these allegations of sexual misconduct against Andrew Cuomo because Governor Cuomo had asked her to do it. He had attempted initially to find investigators who he seemed to believe it seemed were people he could trust or that he felt more comfortable with. And were close political allies of his, and he got a lot of pushback in New York over those choices, and ended up saying, "Fine, we'll have Letitia James do it." And then, she hires 2 excellent investigators, former lead prosecutor for New York State and a well-regarded expert on sexual harassment and misconduct, and they come out with a report. Having interviewed a number of women that found ample evidence, they concluded, of violations of both state and federal civil rights law. And at that point, of course, what you saw Cuomo's attorneys doing and Cuomo himself doing is trying to discredit this investigation, discredit the accusers. And then on top of that, you then had Cuomo saying that, well, this is a political attack by Letitia James because, she wants to run for governor. She wants to get me out of the way, was more or less the message. And sure enough, Letitia James has now declared a run for governor of New York. And, I'll speak from my own interpretation of this. I certainly do think it is possible both to lead a well-founded and rigorous investigation of a governor that has findings of violations of anti-harassment law, and to also politically benefit from getting him out of the way. I don't think those two points of view are incompatible, but in the telling of Cuomo and his allies, it's simply this was a political hit job.
And Alyssa, we really haven't heard much, if anything, from the former governor. What has he been up to since he resigned?
I am not so sure. I mean, we hear reports that he has been living in Long Island. He does not have a residence of his own. He may now, but, he had moved out of his girlfriend Sandra Lee's home in Westchester when they split. He had been living full time in the governor's mansion in Albany. And when he resigned in August, that he lost his home. And so, he is now in the position of having, he will have to physically appear in Albany on November 17th, which is the date of his appearance in court on this one criminal charge. It's a misdemeanor charge of forcible touching, which, is brought in a rather messy, complicated way, but brought by a complaint by the Albany sheriff that was made public last week. And, it's the kind of allegation or kind of charge that would normally not result in prison time, although that is allowed under the law of imprisonment of up to 1 year. Typically, a defendant would plead such charges down. And it remains to be seen, how will Cuomo's attorneys and Cuomo plead on this? Or will they just try to contest it? Would he want the possibility of a trial? Most likely not. So, this is a situation where he's not really facing a stiff criminal penalty. It's just much more about the optics, frankly, of our former governor, nationally admired figure for his leadership in a number of areas, who had such a hard fall after these accusations and after the report, now in the context of a courtroom as a criminal defendant.
Yeah, a hard fall indeed. Alyssa Katz. Alyssa, always good to have you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.